Welcome to Caspar David Friedrich and the Düsseldorf Romantics. Today, the landscape paintings of Caspar David Friedrich are considered to be some of the most important of the German Romantic period. However, at the time they were created, Friedrich's contemplative and tranquil style was often poorly received. Although Friedrich initially found favour among a number of prominent collectors, the Dresden artist soon became overshadowed by painters of the Düsseldorf School. Indeed, it was the Düsseldorf School's co-founder, Carl Friedrich Lessing, who eventually became the undisputed star of German landscape painting. Such a development not only illustrated a change in artistic tastes, but also a fundamental transformation in how people perceived art's role in society. Caspar David Friedrich still believed that his paintings should serve as a mediator between the viewer and the divine, whereas the contrasting view saw art as autonomous, serving only itself. It was the latter view which eventually prevailed, and it wasn't until the end of the 19th century that Friedrich began to be re-evaluated and finally acknowledged as one of the greats in art history.
Yet for all their differences, there was still much that united Caspar David Friedrich with the landscape painters of the Düsseldorf School, not least in terms of their motifs, which ran from Gothic ruins to scenes bathed in moonlight. This exhibition aims to show you how the painters of the Düsseldorf School initially adopted Friedrich's style, only to then go their own way within the wider Romantic movement. In order to make the similarities and differences between Friedrich and the Düsseldorfers as tangible as possible, we'll be comparing paintings of the two styles throughout this tour. We hope you enjoy the journey. Johann Wilhelm Schirmer was the Düsseldorf Academy's very first professor of landscape painting, and hanging next to two of his oil studies, here is a landscape by Caspar David Friedrich. If we compare them, it's possible to find initial similarities. Both painters were interested in the precise and exact study of nature. Friedrich's painting shows the elongated ridges of the so-called giant mountains in what's now the Czech Republic and Poland. Friedrich enjoyed hiking through them with his painter friend Georg Friedrich Kersting. Johann Wilhelm Schirmer also made regular trips into nature to make his drawings. In fact, Schirmer brought back so many sketches from his hiking trips that he could wallpaper his studio with them.
So after those similarities, what distinguishes these landscapes from each other? Well, to a large extent, when looking at Schirmer's two oil studies, we seem to enter them, like stepping through a window. Schirmer has recreated his foreground in rich detail, while Friedrich has immersed his own foreground in an enigmatic darkness. So our gaze doesn't find a foothold when entering Friedrich's painting. Instead, we are drawn onwards by it, flying out over an almost abstract geometric space filled with staggered hills, to finally lose ourselves in the distant horizon and the infinite sky. That's where the golden yellow sunlight shines, with the curve of its glow corresponding to a hill-formed hollow on the earth. This elliptical structure in Friedrich's painting creates an impression of harmony, perhaps even of divine order. If you look carefully, you'll also find a single shepherd facing us on a rock in his landscape. The figure seems to be at one with nature, embedded and secure. By contrast, in Schirmer's studies, such a metaphysical or even spiritual impact is neither intended nor desired. This landscape by Caspar David Friedrich is entitled Drifting Clouds Over the Giant Mountains, and it's been constructed from several pictorial layers. Behind its veil of frayed, drifting clouds lie chains of bluish hills, which eventually dissolve into what some consider to be the sea. These fleeting clouds serve to expand our view by both covering and revealing. The chains of blue hills also seem to continue on forever to each side. There is no figure or narrative here to distract from the landscape. And, as is often the case with Friedrich's work, when viewing this landscape, we end up feeling as if we are somehow viewing ourselves and our own limitations. The abrupt abyss dropping down from the meadow seems threatening and unsettling, whereas the ray of light reflecting in the small mountain lake appears to offer hope and spiritual comfort. Throughout his life, Friedrich preferred to draw his inspiration from the native landscapes of his homeland, rather than from foreign countries. For instance, he never travelled to Italy, which was an expected part of an artist's classical training at that time. Instead, Friedrich chose to hike his way across the island of Rügen and the Harz Mountains in Germany, or the so-called Giant Mountains, which span today's Czech Republic and Poland. The sketches that he made during such trips were then used again and again by Friedrich throughout the following decades, so it's impossible to say for sure exactly which location he used for this landscape. The same also applies to his mountain landscape hanging beside it. As Friedrich wrote himself,
"The task of the painter is not to faithfully reproduce air, water, rocks and trees, but his own soul. It's his own sensibilities that should be reflected. To recognize the spirit of nature, to penetrate and absorb it, to reproduce it with all your heart and mind. That's what a work of art is for." Two hunters gaze over a summer plateau. But unlike in most of Caspar David Friedrich's works, these figures are recognizable as specific people. On the left is its painter Carl Friedrich Lessing, and on the right is his friend and fellow artist Johann Wilhelm Schirmer. These two gentlemen are considered the founding fathers of the Düsseldorf School of landscape painting, its two chiefs, as they were known at the time. Lessing and Schirmer accompanied each other regularly on hikes to explore their surroundings and make sketches. Importantly, in this painting, Lessing has integrated their two figures into the landscape. He's made them part of its story. Thanks to the props he's placed in the scene, such as their bag on the ground and their hunted game, it's clear that Lessing is encouraging us to imagine some kind of a summer hunting tale while we're looking at it. It was ultimately this incorporation of an inner story, a narrative, that helped the Düsseldorf School become so popular. As the curator Dr. Bettina Baumgörtel explains,
Tatsächlich unterscheiden sich die Bilder der Düsseldorfer Malerschule.
The landscapes from the Düsseldorf School differed fundamentally from the hushed moods and stricter structures of Friedrich's paintings. And not surprisingly, such pictures that told us stories were far more popular with the general public than those that simply showed empty spaces where nothing much seemed to be happening.
Ereignislose Räume versteht sich eigentlich von selbst.
a kneeling couple dressed in medieval costume is praying at the foot of a mighty oak. The object of their veneration is shaded and indistinct, but we can just make out a carving of the Virgin Mary attached to the trunk. The warm sunlight makes the branches of the tree glow in multiple tones of green. Meticulously painted butterbur plants line a stream which leads our gaze into a valley of rugged rock. This exterior scene could be part of a legend or a fairy tale. It makes us wonder where the couple's journey will lead them next. As Dr. Bettina Baumgörtel explains,
Das ist der wesentliche Unterschied zwischen Friedrich und den Düsseldorfern.
That's the fundamental difference between Caspar David Friedrich and the Düsseldorf School. The Düsseldorfers were storytellers, and they were also always looking backwards in time, in the sense that their stories were almost always about historical things like robbers, knights, nymphs and maidens. They were basically telling us fairy tales.
Nymphen und schönen Jungfrauen, sie sind eben Märchenerzähler.
Carl Friedrich Lessing was a central figure of the Düsseldorf School, and art critics of the period praised him for the fact that his works didn't just try to capture passing moments, but entire poems. On the other hand, the same voices criticized Friedrich for what they saw as the fleetingness and emptiness of his paintings. When Lessing created this painting in 1837, he was considered to be the most pioneering landscape painter in Germany. Importantly, alongside his meticulous study of nature, his landscapes also told a narrative. Thanks to a technique known as staffage, in which artists add supporting figures to a scene, he was able to successfully turn his landscapes into a form of literature. This window is located in Caspar David Friedrich's studio, and the woman standing at it is the artist's wife, Caroline. But as Caroline can only be seen from behind, it can't really be described as a portrait. Friedrich had waited until he was in his mid-40s to get married. It was only then that he felt he had a sufficient income. By positioning Caroline at the window, with her gaze looking outwards, Friedrich has focused our attention here on the theme of looking, and how we consciously see things. Importantly, Caroline's head is at least partially blocking our view of what she's seeing, which is a landscape along the river Elbe. We can glimpse the masts of 2 sailing boats and the surface of the river, but beyond that, both her view into the distance and ours is blocked by a row of poplars. So in other words, the only things that she or we can see beyond those obstacles are the things that we can imagine in our thoughts.
Depictions of interiors are extremely rare in Friedrich's work. And even here, he juxtaposes the interior and the exterior worlds, with his wife connecting the darkness and light like an intermediary. Her body is at a slight angle to the strictly geometric interior, and as she leans forward toward the bright world of nature, she seems to embody an indefinite sense of longing. Friedrich is careful not to provide us with any fixed interpretation for this scene, and that's no doubt one of the reasons why his works continue to fascinate us today. As the artist himself noted,
"It's perhaps the greatest reward of all for an artist to stimulate, to awaken thoughts, feelings, and sensations in the viewer, even if they aren't his own."
This painting of an artist's studio transports you directly into the Düsseldorf Art Academy of 1836. The picture is a collaborative work, and you can read the signatures of the 6 painters depicted in it on top of the right-hand wall. The basic idea for it, and most of its execution, came from Johann Peter Hasenkleber. He's the man in the centre, dragging away one of the mannequins that were used for studies of clothing. The diminutive artist in front of him is mimicking the pose made by the plaster cast of an antique statue on the far left, though with the added prop of a bottle of wine. The artist who's modelling for them has been dressed up as a robber in a tattered black hat. His rounded shoulders and falling stockings make him seem anything but heroic. Part of the intention of this painting is to mock the old-fashioned artistic doctrine of the Academy's director, Wilhelm von Schadow. But at the same time, the close interplay between art and life in this painting serves to characterize the new philosophy of these young artists at the Düsseldorf School.
The atmosphere in this studio scene is highly dignified and serious. In it, a collection of notable artistic celebrities witnessed the completion of a colossal bust immortalizing the poet Ludwig Tieck. From left to right, the painting shows the diplomat, writer and Shakespearean translator Count von Baudissin, the painter and Academy professor Carl Christian Vogel von Vogelstein, who also painted the picture, the sculptor Pierre-Jean David, also known as David d'Angers, the Freiherr von Stackelberg, a classical scholar and aristocrat, the painter and physician Carl Gustav Caros, Carl Christian von Vogelstein's young son Johannes, the poet Ludwig Tieck, and the poet's daughter Dorothea Tieck, who was also a translator of Shakespeare. The setting is Vogelstein's own studio in Dresden, which has obviously been decorated to impress. Vogelstein was a professor at the Dresden Academy of Art, and the large format cartoons on his walls are there to represent his works. The portrait of Raphael above the door symbolizes his obvious high standards. Just like the bustling studio scene from Düsseldorf, this painting also characterizes the artist's studio as a vibrant place of exchange, and in that way, they couldn't be more different from the studio scene hanging on the opposite wall, which portrays Caspar David Friedrich as a lonely genius. Caspar David Friedrich was born in 1774 in the town of Greifswald on the German Baltic coast. His father was a soap boiler and his family were Protestant Lutherans. In 1794, at the age of 20, Friedrich went to Copenhagen to study art at the Royal Danish Academy. A few years later, he chose Dresden as his home, which at that time was a major centre for the arts. In 1808, Friedrich achieved particular fame with his so-called Tätchen altarpiece, a work which ignited profound debate by elevating a landscape painting to the status of religious art. Despite the praise that Friedrich undoubtedly received for many of his works, he also suffered from a great deal of criticism throughout his career. Indeed, by the time painting styles started to change in the 1830s, Friedrich was already in his late 50s and increasingly treated as an artistic outsider. To many, Friedrich's paintings seemed too religious, too constructed, too melancholic.
This portrait, showing Friedrich as a lonely artist in contemplation of his work, was painted by his good friend Georg Friedrich Kersting. Friedrich's studio appears very sparse in it. The only things to hang on his wall are the tools of his trade, including a straight-edge ruler and a T-square. These are no doubt meant to symbolically represent the precise geometric forms that can be found in Friedrich's compositions, such as triangles, parabola curves, and the golden ratio. In this portrait, too, the geometric construction deserves attention. Its central vertical axis runs precisely through Friedrich's head, which is of course the location of his reflection. It seems that here, art is being displayed above all as an eternal spiritual process. For as Friedrich himself believed,
"First close your physical eye so that you may see the image with your spiritual eye. Then bring what you've seen in that darkness to light so that it may affect others in reverse, from the outside in." From the 8 surviving self-portraits of Caspar David Friedrich, this one stands out in particular due to the forcefulness of its gaze. There's no hint at all of a smile around these lips. Rather, Friedrich's face pierces us with its gravity and seriousness. One half of his face is shadowed, the other brightly lit. His probing eyes sit beneath the furrowed brow. His left eyebrow is raised. His expression seems critical. Friedrich used none of his usual painting tools for this self-portrait, so it's almost as if he wants to tell us here that the only tool he really needs is his ability to look and see. But that shouldn't surprise us. At the beginning of the 19th century, it was above all Friedrich's ability to exactly reproduce what he saw in nature that led to such a profound revitalization of German landscape painting. Friedrich's face is framed by long sideburns in this picture, and it was speculated even during his lifetime that these were grown to hide a scar from an earlier suicide attempt. At the time this self-portrait was made, however, Friedrich had much to celebrate. The Crown Prince of Prussia and the Duke of Saxe-Weimar-Eisenach had both purchased several important paintings from him in 1810. And authors such as Clemens Brentano, Achim von Arnim, and Heinrich von Kleist had all written favourable reviews of his exhibition. Yet, only a couple of years earlier, Friedrich had experienced a serious and damaging controversy surrounding his Tätchen altarpiece. The exhibition curator Dr. Jan Nikolaisen explains.
Damals war heftig dafür kritisiert worden, seiner Landschaftsmalerei einen religiösen Charakter zu verleihen.
Friedrich had recently been very heavily criticized for giving a religious meaning to a landscape painting. So perhaps the robe he's wearing in this self-portrait is a statement of what he truly believes. Rather than wearing a piece of contemporary clothing, his robe reminds us of a monk's habit. So is the artist trying to tell us here that his work shouldn't only be defined by his precise observation of nature, but also by his deep inner faith?
Wie die genaue Naturbeobachtung.
This large format drawing was made in preparation for the painting that was to make Caspar David Friedrich famous in the first decade of the 19th century. Unfortunately, however, his so-called Tetschen altarpiece also triggered a fierce public dispute between its critics and its supporters about the nature of religious art. The scandal had to do with Friedrich's idea of placing the motif of the crucified Christ in the middle of a native forest landscape, which people would find familiar. The Prussian Chamberlain, Friedrich von Ramdor, even went so far as to publish a diatribe against the painting in 1809, stating,
"How presumptuous these landscape painters are, wanting to creep into our churches and up onto our altars."
What Friedrich was really trying to do, of course, was to make the correlation between God and nature more comprehensible to his viewers. He therefore answered that
art should never be a mere skill, but should rather be the chosen language of our feelings, our moods, even of our devotion and our prayer. For my part, I demand from a piece of art that it should raise the spirit, and, even if not solely and exclusively, that it should produce religious upliftment.
This is how the exhibition curator Dr. Jan Nicolaisen describes the picture.
Das Kruzifix verwandelt die unregelmäßige, naturhafte Aufwärtsbewegung der Felsen.
The crucifix transforms the naturally irregular upward thrusting movement of the rocks into a focused yearning for spiritual ascension.
Hier zu Altar und Kirche.
The rocks and nature basically become an altar and a church. But instead of the ethereal light of heaven shining in through the church windows, it now beams down directly onto the crucifix. Despite the spruces and rocks being so realistic, Friedrich's composition and use of light serve to create a higher, more idealized reality. This juxtaposition of allegorical and seemingly banal motifs unsettled many of his contemporaries.
Verunsicherte das zeitgenössische Publikum.
At the start of his career, Friedrich had mainly made a name for himself through the skill of his drawings. It was only later that he devoted himself to painting. A church emerges from the mist like a floating vision, with only its upper half visible. Its fantasy Gothic architecture suggests links to the Middle Ages, a period defined by Christianity. The top of the fir tree and the tip of the church spire are precisely aligned. The silhouettes of the tree and the church also show parallels. Yet even before we consciously recognize these formal connections, they've already created a relationship between nature and religion in our minds. The images that Caspar David Friedrich created of the natural world often suggest a divine connection. In the foreground here, two crutches lie discarded in the snow. They lead our eyes to the man who's laid them there. His hands are clasped and he's praying to the crucifix. The boulder he's leaning against can be interpreted as the rock of faith.
Despite the subtle effect that Friedrich's paintings have on us, they are nevertheless based on strict formal principles. His placement of the tree, for example, is in perfect accordance with the so-called golden ratio, a theory of proportions which has traditionally been perceived as harmonious in the Western art.
Caspar David Friedrich was certainly an artist with political convictions. He probably designed this war memorial immediately after Dresden was liberated from the occupying forces of Napoleon in the autumn of 1813. It was officially intended to commemorate the fallen freedom fighters, though Friedrich's good friend, the poet Theodor Körner, had also lost his life fighting the Napoleonic troops. But Friedrich's monument to the fallen was never built, and the artist expressed his deep disappointment about this in a letter to the writer and historian Ernst Moritz Arndt. In it he wrote,
"I'm not at all surprised that no monuments are being erected, neither to the great cause of our people nor to the noble deeds of individual German men. As long as we remain the servants of princes, nothing so great will ever happen. In places where the people have no voice, they are never allowed to show emotions or honor themselves."
With these words, Friedrich openly declared himself in opposition to the ruling feudal state. A few years later, this would make him a target in the so-called persecution of the demagogues, which aimed to suppress any national revolutionary tendencies that had arisen after 1819. Friedrich's letter was confiscated during a search of Arndt's apartment and used as evidence against Arndt in his interrogation. Friedrich's paintings also express his sympathy for national liberal ideas, especially through the old-style traditional German costumes that he often dresses his figures in. This type of clothing had actually been temporarily banned by the German authorities due to its politically provocative effect. In his later self-portrait, included in the painting The Stages of Life, Friedrich even wears such clothing himself. A raven caws, and a lone wanderer heads slowly into the depths of a dark, impenetrable forest. A labyrinth of spruce trees lies before him, and his journey into them seems threatened with a hopeless dead end. We as viewers look down on the scene from a slightly elevated and detached position. Ever since this painting was first presented in Berlin in 1814, people have interpreted the wanderer as being a so-called chasseur, a soldier-hunter of the French army. And indeed, just 1 year earlier, that same army under Napoleon had suffered a decisive defeat against the Prussian and Allied forces at the Battle of Leipzig. This image was therefore interpreted by many in a patriotic sense, as a symbolic representation of the French defeat.
However, Friedrich's lone soldier isn't facing defeat at the hands of a superior army here, but at the hands of nature. Its forest setting could even be seen as an allusion to the ancient Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, in which the Germanic tribes under Arminius famously drove out the Romans. That same German forest theme had played a role in the wars against Napoleon, when bands of irregulars had used the forests as cover to attack the French. But whatever the symbolism, Friedrich is careful not to overplay the patriotic theme. He shows us no glorious victors, just a lone, dignified man facing defeat.
Caspar David Friedrich was undoubtedly a patriot, and as a Democrat, he certainly hoped to see more freedoms for the German people after Napoleon's defeat. But in this, he was to be deeply disappointed. Interestingly, the old-style traditional German costumes that many of Friedrich's figures wear can actually be interpreted as an expression of his politics. You'll see a prime example of this later in his painting, The Stages of Life. Flames burn in the house in the hollow, while the church on the hilltop stands safe and secure. The narrative style employed by Caspar David Friedrich in this dramatic early work makes it truly exceptional. The painting was once owned by Duke Karl August of Weimar. He and Friedrich shared a deep dislike of Napoleon, who at that time had conquered large parts of Germany. But although, as a commoner, Friedrich was free to make no secret of his aversion to the French emperor, the Duke needed to keep his feelings hidden. His small duchy of Saxe-Weimar-Eisenach had almost been dissolved during Napoleon's expansionism, and it was only allowed to continue now in exchange for a number of concessions and the Duke's pledge of allegiance.
Like other paintings by Friedrich that were owned by the Duke, this apparently serene landscape offers the viewer a second, distinctly patriotic interpretation, though Friedrich's analogy is so subtle that the Duke could even have displayed this painting in public. There is no overt symbolism or figure in uniform here, But the message is nevertheless clear once you realize that thanks to such greats as Johann Wolfgang von Goethe and Carl Friedrich Schinkel, Gothic architecture had become anchored in the German consciousness as a particularly Germanic style. So the enduring Gothic church standing steadfastly on the hill can actually be seen as a German stronghold against invaders. Beyond that, the church also symbolizes the strength that can be drawn from faith in such difficult times. It brings to mind the words of one of Martin Luther's most famous hymns.
A mighty fortress is our God, a bulwark never failing, our helper he, amid the flood of mortal ills prevailing.
A group of pilgrims arrive at a mountain chapel at sunrise. They presumably set out from the valley during the night and hiked up through the cold, snowy landscape in the dark. The stone chapel now promises them refuge. Having endured the hardship and toil of their journey, these faithful pilgrims are embraced by the beauty of a new winter's day.
The Dresden painter Ernst Ferdinand Oehme was once a student of Caspar David Friedrich. As his subject for this painting, he has chosen people of faith. The Mountain Chapel is one of Oehme's later works, but the soft pink of its dawn and the elevated chapel at the center of its symmetrical composition are still very reminiscent of Friedrich, as is the fact that its devotional space is located outdoors, within nature. Yet at the same time, the influence of the Düsseldorf School can also be seen in Oehme's painting, particularly in its clear narrative and tendency towards the idyllic. When the painters of the Düsseldorf School first exhibited their work in Dresden in 1836, it caused such a sensation that many artists soon began to adopt their Düsseldorf style. But sadly, the same thing never happened for Caspar David Friedrich. A Friedrich style never emerged among his contemporaries, and the Dresden Academy of his hometown even denied him the directorship of their very own landscape department. Oehme's Mountain Chapel was typical for the popular tastes of the period. It was first exhibited in 1842 by the Art Association of Saxony, who also purchased it. As a practiced poet, Oehme even wrote a poem to accompany his Mountain Chapel. Listen to it now in an English translation.
Covered slight with night-blown snow, and shining soft in morning glow, awakes the chapel high. Its candles summon bright and warm, through coloured panes against the dawn. The holy meal is nigh. And valley echoes tiny bell, tormented souls in fear of hell. Salvation waits above. Oh, free yourself from all your sin. Confess the guilt that lies within, through pilgrimage of love.
The painter Johann Heinrich Ferdinand Olivier belonged to the so-called Nazarene movement, and from 1811 to a group within that movement known specifically as the Brothers of St. Luke. These artists strove to renew Christian religious painting in the realistic style of the Renaissance. This particular drawing by Olivier shows the garden of the Capuchin monastery in Salzburg. He drew it as a standalone work, but returned to it a few years later to create a painting with the same motif. The garden appears shielded from the world by the monastery buildings and the adjoining woods. It is a place of tranquility, with one monk bent over working and another standing upright. This closer, standing monk resembles some kind of a guardian, positioned on the threshold between the garden and the wider landscape, between a nature that's been cultivated and a nature that's been left to itself. The figure's serious but welcoming gaze seems to both scrutinize us and invite us to enter. The curator Dr. Jan Nicolaisen describes it this way.
Olivier hat die Zeichnung in äußerster Detailtreue mit Feder und Bleistift ausgeführt.
Olivier created this drawing in pen and pencil. and he paid very close attention to the detail. Thanks to its combination of naturalism and religious sentiment, his monastery garden could be likened in principle to the works of Caspar David Friedrich, though as a Protestant Lutheran, Friedrich actually felt a strong aversion to the Catholic-influenced paintings of the Nazarenes. Due to the fact that they borrowed their style from earlier epochs, he accused them of lacking their own artistic language. Friedrich also probably saw his Nazarene colleagues as direct competition on the contemporary art market.
Seine nazarenischen Kollegen auch als eine Konkurrenz auf dem zeitgenössischen Kunstmarkt.
What kind of frosty youth would paint such a winter scene? I've heard good things about this young man, and he certainly has talent. But I want nothing to do with this winter landscape, nor with its monks or burials. It's all so negative, nothing but death or cold detachment.
Such damning criticism for this picture came from none other than Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Painted by Carl Friedrich Lessing, its motif shows a group of monks burying their departed brother in winter. And that was obviously too melancholy a subject for Goethe's mood. Or perhaps he simply found it too close to Caspar David Friedrich's work. Friedrich's own painting of a cemetery in the snow hangs next to it. At the time he painted this monastery courtyard, Lessing was still at the beginning of his career. Goethe recommended more life-affirming subjects to him. Death and impermanence were not to his taste.
Lessing was destined to soon replace Caspar David Friedrich as Germany's leading landscape painter, just as the late Romantics of the Düsseldorf School would quickly come to dominate the exhibitions and collections. Of course, there were several reasons for this takeover, and they certainly included a general desire to see more uplifting themes. But an equally important factor was the growing rejection of any kind of religious function in art. Instead, art was now expected to exist only for itself. In landscapes, people increasingly expected scenes to be natural and realistic rather than symbolic. And this in turn led to a movement away from the subdued pictures of Friedrich in favour of those that showed something happening.
You'll also find a painting on display in this room by another Dresden artist who was heavily influenced by Friedrich in his early years. His name was Carl Gustav Karus, and his painting is called The Cemetery on Euben Hill. Karus later distanced himself from Friedrich's work, and indeed, the obituary that Karus wrote after Friedrich's death only served to solidify the notion that Friedrich's art had been far too influenced by his melancholy and depressive personality.
The artist Carl Friedrich Lessing was still a young man when he achieved success with this painting at the Berlin Academy exhibitions of 1826 and 1830. In it, he invites us to observe nature overgrowing an old abandoned cemetery and its gravestones. At the right edge of the picture is a church ruin with its crumbling stonework pointing up into the sky. Dramatic lighting illuminates a gravestone in the foreground, but the words on it can no longer be read. Lessing isn't only emphasizing the transience of life here, but also of our memories. Lessing's painting clearly stands in the Romantic tradition of Caspar David Friedrich. Yet their contemporaries were far more interested in pointing out the differences between these two artists rather than anything that connected them. While art critics accused Friedrich's pieces of being monotonous, gloomy and depressing, they celebrated Lessing's paintings as being varied, refreshing and full of life. Lessing's works featured more detail and were in larger formats than Friedrich's works, which appealed more to the public. And of course, Lessing's mix of naturalistic style with dramatic staging proved far more accessible than Friedrich's strict compositions and internalized symbolism.
This landscape by Carl Friedrich Lessing shows just how innovative Friedrich's main rival could be. Rather than combining several landscape studies into a single dramatic composition, as was usually done, Lessing has chosen here to paint a real section of landscape in the Harz Mountains, and instead of concentrating on the impressive rock formations in the background, he has devoted his attention to a grassy area in the foreground that at first glance seems unremarkable. The grass has been divided up by criss-crossing patches of sand created by erosion and people's footsteps. Lessing was very interested in the then young science of geology, and he used all that he could learn about the subject in his paintings. He was a master at capturing the precise character of soil and rocks, and through that he was able to make nature itself a subject. Unlike the other works of Lessing that we've seen so far, this landscape stands on its own 2 feet, without the need for any additional historical scenery or human characters. Instead, Lessing has used its ragged bushes, drifting clouds, and dry grasses to tell us a different kind of story about the movement and life of nature. Lessing wrote this about the kinds of landscapes that interested him.
I don't understand why people travel so far away to paint their studies. If I had the time and money, I'd first travel systematically through Germany, where there are still so many interesting and unknown areas.
Lessing's love for the landscapes of his homeland is another thing that he had in common with Caspar David Friedrich. However, Lessing's preference for displaying the unadorned realism of nature was fundamentally at odds with Friedrich's desire to use nature to evoke emotions.
From the fairy tales of the Brothers Grimm to the first historical novels, references to the past were a fundamental ingredient in Germany's Romantic movement. And it was just the same for the painters of the Düsseldorf School. Indeed, the Düsseldorf painters would often seek inspiration by meeting of an evening to read such historical works aloud. But importantly, the Romantic period was also responsible for inspiring the preservation of history in the real world too. Everywhere one looked, ruined castles and palaces started to be restored or rebuilt, including even the Cologne Cathedral, which was finally finished during the Romantic era. Stories and fantasies about the Middle Ages served to re-enchant the world for many people, harkening back to some lost time when everything was supposed to have existed in harmony.
This painting of the Ahr Valley and Altena Castle is by the artist Johann Wilhelm Schirmer. Already as a boy, Schirmer had loved to sketch the landscapes around his hometown of Jülich, and this scene is also one that he was very familiar with. However, Schirmer has chosen not to reproduce a realistic view of the already ruined castle here. Instead, he has made it an inhabited fortress again, complete with a stately keep and solid walls. But at the same time, he has been careful to remove the castle's actual gateway complex, which still stretches down the hill today. What we see, therefore, is the same fantasy castle that Schirmer's goatherd sees, an isolated citadel set in a striking landscape crowning a rugged hill. Schirmer referred to this painting as a romantic landscape. For him, to romanticize something meant to heighten it, to increase its potential, just like the early Romantic writer Novalis had once demanded,
"The world must be romanticized. That's the only way to discover its original meaning. And to romanticize it, we must increase its qualitative potential. I romanticize things by giving the mundane a higher purpose, the ordinary the prestige of mystery, the known the dignity of secrecy, and the finite the appearance of infinity." Oswald Achenbach was the younger brother of Andreas Achenbach, whose painting of a shipwreck in the Norwegian Sea we'll encounter later. Oswald Achenbach held a professorship for landscape painting at the Düsseldorf Academy, and he was widely considered to be the leading Italy painter of his time. In this work, entitled View of Ischia from Naples, he has combined 2 motifs linked to the theme of longing, Bella Italia and the moon, which bathes this landscape in its tantalizing glow. Oswald's various painting techniques are also of interest here. While the sky is realistic and natural, the foreground contains sections that are almost impressionistic in style. These sections rely merely on unblended light and colours for their effects, sometimes applied with a brush, sometimes with fingers, and sometimes with a palette knife.
The scene unfolding on the promenade is folkloric in nature. A flower seller offers his wares to a strolling couple. Fishermen sit on the quay wall, someone beats a tambourine, and even a donkey is present. This stage-like panorama on the waterfront ends with the bulwark of Castel dell'Ovo. There's an obvious difference between this narrative painting by Oswald Achenbach and the solemn stillness of the moonlit landscapes by Caspar David Friedrich. But that's hardly surprising. By the time this painting was created in 1888, Friedrich's work had long since faded into obscurity. In fact, it wasn't until 1906, in the so-called Exhibition of the Century at Berlin's National Gallery, that Friedrich's genius was finally recognized. And while Friedrich was rehabilitated there, the influence of the Düsseldorf School began to decline. Above all, this shows that the way works of art are perceived always has as much to do with the time they're viewed in as the works themselves. Indeed, as Friedrich himself once noted,
"Like others, I can only spin myself into my cocoon and leave it to time to decide what emerges from it. A dazzling butterfly or a maggot." This painting by Johann Wilhelm Schirmer is a study made in the open air during one of his hikes through the Neander Valley near Düsseldorf. Schirmer had even built himself a shaded folding chair for such journeys, which included a custom-made painting box with a special lid for carrying paper. It wasn't possible at that time to buy such professional painting boxes from a shop. Schirmer loved to explore the Düsseldorf countryside on foot, and he was often accompanied by his good friend Carl Friedrich Lessing. The close observations of nature that they both made during these hikes formed the basis for most of their landscape paintings. Schirmer also led his students on excursions into nature once he began teaching at the Düsseldorf Academy, and this eventually led to the emergence of a whole hiking movement.
Schirmer himself would never have considered exhibiting this study in its own right. For him, the painting was simply raw material, for reference only. Indeed, if you look closely, you'll find these reeds exactly reproduced in Schirmer's large-format painting of a forest scene, also hanging in this room. Have you found it yet? And the reeds in the foreground? That painting is called a self-created landscape, which means that it isn't intended to depict any specific location. Instead, Schirmer's working method was to first invent a composition in his mind, and then to head out into the countryside in search of the individual natural elements that he needed. After sketching each of them in detail, he'd finally paint them and merge them all together in the finished picture. Schirmer's painting of this invented forest was his very first exhibited work in oil. It was shown in Berlin in 1828, and it caused such a stir that it ultimately marked the start of the Düsseldorf School of Landscape Painting's success.
"I will still remember this island in heaven."
That was how the landscape painter Friedrich Preller described the North German island of Rügen, the raw beauty of which he's captured in this painting. A gnarled oak stands rooted in sandy soil, its branches stretching upwards in bizarre twists. The low horizon provides space for a spectacular cloud show in the background. To the right of the oak, a formation of stones leads our gaze into the depths of the picture, out towards the sea. The stones are a megalithic tomb from the Neolithic period, which German tradition describes as a Hünengrab, or grave of a giant, though such giants should be more thought of as great forefathers or heroes, rather than as any kind of mythical ogres. The combination of these ancient stones with the boundless sea can be interpreted as an allegory for the vastness of time and space, against which our human lives seem short and meaningless. Coming from the German city of Weimar, Preller would certainly have been familiar with Caspar David Friedrich's own Hünengrab paintings. But as he was also a close friend of the Düsseldorf painter Johann Wilhelm Schirmer, he could be seen as acting as a link between the two movements. Further to the left on the wall, another painting also shows the ancient stones of a Hünengrab. That version is by Johann Christian Clausen Dahl, who was a good friend and long-time lodger of Caspar David Friedrich in Dresden. Dahl's painting is set in deepest winter, which reinforces the theme of transience. However, elements such as the inhabited farmstead in the background, the returning hunter and the warmth of the sunlight also offer a sense of hope. The image of a Hünengrab surrounded by oak trees was a very potent symbol to Germans of their Germanic Nordic past. Filled with mythological magic, such scenes also became a concrete symbol for German patriotism during the Napoleonic occupation. The Rügen pastor Ludwig Kosegarten even wrote a popular poem called The Hünengrab, and following its publication, Rügen came to be seen as the epitome of the Nordic Germanic landscape. Here are just some of the evocative words he wrote.
Between 4 mossy stones, under 3 rustling oaks I sit here. Over those 4 mossy stones, over those 3 rustling oaks, reigns peace and rest. You who slumber below, you heroes, glorious ones, slumber softly now, you who fell in the bloody battle.
And a few verses later,
Sleep softly, you noble fallen, sleep softly in the ring of stones. Sleep softly, or rise up. With your scarred forehead, with your blood-streaked breast, rise up and give me your hand. Full of calluses for the freedom that I also love, like you. I, one of your grandsons, one of the latter, one of the weaker. Bondage clings to the sons of the free. The welts of the despot's whip brand the backs of the sons of heroes.
turf, chalk cliffs and sea. The rapid progression of these 3 pictorial planes makes us feel as if we're about to tumble down into them at any moment. Unlike in his landscapes, this seascape by Friedrich no longer leads our gaze into the vastness of space, but into the depths of the abyss, into some immediate and existential threat. Friedrich visited the North German island of Rügen on several occasions, including on his honeymoon. The island had been a popular travel destination ever since the 18th century, and he loved to go hiking there. Indeed, Friedrich earned his first living as an artist drawing light-filled sepia panoramas of the Rügen coastline. He may have intended this watercolour to be part of a larger Rügen series. The Prussian scholar and statesman Wilhelm von Humboldt once wrote that it was impossible to find a simpler and more sublime view than from the chalk cliffs of Rügen, where the thrill of looking down into the abyss becomes inseparable from the comforting view of the ocean. Friedrich too has managed to link that sublime sea with the rough grass in his foreground, forever careful to treat the large and small elements of his paintings with equal respect. For, as he said himself,
nothing is secondary in a picture. Everything belongs inevitably to the whole, and must therefore never be neglected.
But in addition to the spatial dimensions of this artwork, there also seems to be a temporal dimension to it, representing the passage of time. The ships we glimpse may allude to our own journey through life, with the fixed solidity of earth and rock giving way to the ever-fluid infinity of the sea and sky. Storm waves throw the ship up like a toy. Its mast is broken. Parts of its railing have splintered away. The deck has been swept clean. At any moment, it may shatter on the cliffs. We fear for the fate of its crew and, in a wider sense, for human existence. Yet at the same time, watching from a distance, we also find it thrilling. Its theatrical lighting and large format remind us of a Hollywood blockbuster. This seascape is by Andreas Achenbach, and at its core, it shows the elemental forces of nature putting mankind back in its place. This was a pertinent message at the beginning of the Industrial Age, when many believed that nature had finally been subdued by man's inventiveness. Such paintings were very popular during this period. In what was seen as an increasingly bourgeois world, they seem to have satisfied a deep longing in people to experience something existential. And of course, even during this period, disasters at sea were all too common.
Achenbach's painting was chiefly inspired by the Dutch seascapes of the 17th century, which he'd become acquainted with during his travels through the Netherlands. It was also influenced by his own experience and studies of sea storms, such as those he made during his 2 trips to Norway, where this painting is set. Achenbach was one of the most influential figures in the Düsseldorf School. He was also a revolutionary spirit who refused to meekly subordinate himself to the authoritarian Prussian state. Such political feelings find expression in this painting in the form of the stormy sea. As you'll see for yourself when you compare this picture to the following paintings, Achenbach's dramatic approach to seascapes couldn't be more at odds with the solemn and still sea paintings created by Caspar David Friedrich. Silver moonlight shimmers on the surface of a smooth, calm sea. The world seems to be suspended in a strange state of stillness. The contours of both the sea and the land are blurred. And my soul spread wide its wings. That was how the poet Joseph von Eichendorff described the effect of moonlight on him. And indeed, such moonlit landscapes as this one by Friedrich are now considered to be the epitome of Romanticism. In many ways they expressed a yearning to return to a shadowy world increasingly destroyed by the advent of street lamps. But because that world of shadows was associated with the sinister as well as the beautiful, many contemporaries criticized Friedrich's works for being too gloomy and melancholic.
It wasn't until the end of the 19th century that Friedrich's moonlight paintings began to be appreciated for their subtle religious content. In this painting, for example, the viewer looks out from an inhospitable shoreline onto an idealized city silhouette reminiscent of a heavenly Jerusalem. As a Christian symbol of hope, the anchor on the shoreline points away from the realm of death and towards eternal life. Above the city, the heavens opens up in the form of an arching dome. Of course, in full accordance with the stipulations of Romanticism, Friedrich's paintings still remain open to various interpretations. For in the words of the philosopher Friedrich Schelling,
every true work of art contains an infinity of intentions capable of infinite interpretations. Yet one can never say whether this infinity lies within the artist himself or merely in the work. The setting sun shines down upon this scene with an almost otherworldly glow. On the gently rolling sea, 5 ships glide towards the shore. If we assign these vessels to the 5 figures in the center of the picture, then the old man with the walking stick corresponds to the largest ship, which is already gathering in its sails. Flanking this vessel on each side is a man in a top hat and a woman lying on the grassy mound. This couple appears to be in the midst of life, and so the smaller boats in the foreground that correspond to them both possess sails that are billowing in the breeze. The 2 ships on the horizon, still with the longest way to go, correspond to the 2 young children at play. Known as The Stages of Life, this painting by Caspar David Friedrich can all too easily be interpreted as an allegory for our journey through life. However, seeing as that title didn't actually come from Friedrich himself, it's also possible to interpret it in other, less obvious ways. For example, a personal, biographical interpretation could also be possible. in which case we would be seeing Friedrich here with his nephew and his 3 children, Gustav Adolf, Agnes Adelheid, and Emma Johanna. The Swedish flag held by the 2 youngest would then refer to Friedrich's own childhood in Greifswald, which at that time belonged to Sweden. Friedrich maintained close connections to Greifswald and Sweden throughout his life.
All we know for certain is that this painting's effect on us is profoundly calming and meditative, even though it's based on a finely constructed pictorial framework. The largest vessel divides the picture precisely into 2 halves, only to then be framed by 2 boats that have been placed in asymmetrical positions. Other examples of this interplay between symmetry and asymmetry can be found elsewhere in the picture. Yet despite all the precision and harmony of Friedrich's compositions, there is never the slightest hint of monotony.